What's going on, Imperials? It's Emperor Cubone here. Evolution often allows Pokémon to tap more fully into their potential, becoming a complete version of the concepts that were originally envisioned. This mostly involves upping the stats, making the designs more intimidating, and even access more powerful attacks. However, sometimes the easiest thing to do to make an evolution stand out is just slap a new type onto it. Sometimes a new type can do wonders for upgrading the Pokémon, and while that might even be the majority of the time, occasionally adding a new type yields mixed results, or maybe even becomes a detriment. So here are the top 6 Pokémon who evolve into worse typings. Number 6, Nincada. Somehow it seems like Nincada goes way under the radar even though both of its evolutions are pretty popular. And it's not uncommon for a base stage Pokemon to get less of the spotlight, but Nincada being the first ever bug and ground type deserves a lot more recognition. In fact, some people still forget that we've ever seen that combination. I guess it doesn't help that the only other option is Wormadam, but Nincada's typing is decent enough with 4 weaknesses and 4 resistances. Well, one of them being an electric immunity, so that's nice. But then Nincada goes from this very underutilized combination to one of the most overused and really unfavorable typings with Bug and Flying. The Flying overlaps on resistances, not actually adding any to maintain the same number, except this time it's immune to Ground, but the Bug type already resisted Ground anyway. So not only does it not help, but it took a previous immunity to Electric that Nincada had and added it as a weakness. So now it's got more than it had before, and what's even worse is that it's now 4 times weak to Rock. Now to be fair, Shedinja gains weaknesses as well, but it also increased the number of resistances to match and brings 2 immunities, plus its ability really means that it's immune to pretty much everything else. So I'm just looking at Ninjask here. It's not like Ninjask is a bad Pokemon, I mean its speed alone makes it a standout. But if we're looking at the raw numbers, there's no denying that its typing got worse upon evolution. And on principle, it's just a shame that they couldn't commit to a unique idea for a fully evolved ground bug. Number 5, Togepi. Now, outside of a Little Cup Metronome League, you're not gonna likely see many people using this baby Pokemon for a lot of combat. But you cannot deny that Pure Fairy is a pretty solid typing, with resistances to Bug, Dark, and Fighting, and being totally untouched by any Dragon moves, while only being weak to the much less common Poison and Steel types. So even if you're not likely to rely on a Togepi as your ace, it would still fare well in an early game setting, and we can all agree that it's decently well off. But a discussion can be started once it evolves into Togetic. This is by no means to say that Togetic is bad, and when it evolves again, Togekiss is remarkably helpful, and as much as the flying type makes total sense on these winged fairies, I'm not sure how beneficial it is. Flying once again overlaps with 2 of Fairy's own resistances, really only offering up one to Grass and a Ground immunity, which is nice, sure, but Ground wasn't exactly your biggest fear before. And is that really worth the new weaknesses to Rock, Ice, and Electric? Listen, I greatly respect the flying type, but when it's really only adding weaknesses, plus the fact that Togetic doesn't even actually learn a single flying type level up move, I don't think that it can really be checked as a positive here, since it can't adequately counter its new weaknesses, and the only way it remotely makes use of the flying type is with Air Slash, and that's just for the flinching, not for the coverage. So maybe grounding it should be in the cards somewhere. Number 4, Surskit. Huh, another unique Hoenn bug. Weird. So Surskit was the first ever bug and water type Pokemon, which was pretty cool to see, and honestly pretty useful near the start if you could find one, although there are other early game water options for Hoenn even without picking Mudkip. But water is generally a benefit in being paired with most anything, since Surskit only has 3 weaknesses to Electric, Flying, and Rock, which you can still erode with your water moves, and then it resists 5 other things on top of that. So the only real downside of this Pond Skater is not learning any bug-type attacks. But then of course it evolves into Masquerain and things get worse. As much as I like this Pokemon's concept, we have already seen how Bug and Flying yields unfavorable results, coming out with more weaknesses and fewer resistances than if you had just kept it in its base form. I get that Masquerain is mostly made up of wings, so it makes sense, but at the same time it still gets tons of water moves, and really the amount of floating or flying Pokemon in Hoenn that aren't actually flying types started to skyrocket. They could have kept it as a water typing and then just give it Levitate. but then I guess it couldn't get Intimidate with those giant eye things. But that leaves us with no fully evolved water and bug types until all the way in Alola. Again, I think Masquerain is a decent Pokemon, I've used it multiple times, but if it had been kept as part water type, it would not only avoid the Stealth Rock calamity, but have made it stand out far more than getting lost in the huge pantheon of bug and flying types. Number 3. Blipbug. Okay, this is the last bug, I promise. And this time it is actually a pure bug, which like most other types has a standard 3 resistances and 3 weaknesses to match. So with the right stats, bug isn't actually that bad, they just don't usually have the right stats, Blipbug included. But when it evolves, I actually love Dottler. It instantly became my favorite pupa Pokemon of them all. I just love its design and functionality, and even if I did appreciate the new psychic offenses, the typing really kind of undercut its survivability. It doubled the amount of weaknesses to 6, since nothing cancelled out, compromising its ability to take out dark types like Nickit, now being weak to them. But speaking of, the only resistance that psychic type added was psychic itself, which wasn't even an issue since you could already take them out with your bug-type attacks. Bugs have a frail reputation as is, but it doesn't help when you heap on a bunch of extra threats to worry about with no real benefits behind it, even if you do have massive special stats like Orbeetle. So no matter how much I like having Dottler on my team, I do wish it were a bit better at surviving. Number 2. Crabrawler. If you can get lucky enough to find an active pile of berries in a secluded spot, you can pick up a free Crabrawler for your Nuzlocke, and a decent fighting type can usually help to carry any team you could think of. So Crabrawler wasn't my favorite Pokemon or anything. I mean, it was nice to see a crab that wasn't the predictable water type, I guess, but I was not prepared for just how bad its evolution would be. Yes, Crabominable is one of my least favorite Pokemon to date, largely because it's just so ugly. I mean, turning into a Yeti doesn't mean that you have to lose all vestige of class. Now, I will admit that fighting and ice are pretty good offensively, hitting most of your major foes for some solid damage, and that can save a Pokemon even with bad matchups like, say, Tyranitar. However, Crabominable lost speed upon evolution, so you're even less likely to get those hits off than you were before. Ice is a notoriously bad partner type, only resisting itself and adding many more weaknesses. And that is the case here for Crabominable, doubling the weaknesses that Crabrawler had with the identical number of resistances, so again, this is only a disadvantage to a Pokemon that got slower. I don't care how powerful its Ice Hammer might be. I know they had to make this combination eventually, but they didn't have to make it so awkward, did they? I guess we should just count ourselves lucky that it takes forever to get to the ice portions of Alola. Number 1. Gloom. Yeah, you knew I had to do this one. Gloom is a perfectly fine Pokemon to put on your team, and Vileplume can actually be pretty handy to use. But that's not the only option Gloom has, just the only reasonable one. Okay, Blossom isn't like the worst Pokemon ever, but let's just take a look at this emo middle stage first. Grass and Poison may be a fairly common typing, but it's not all that bad, with 4 weaknesses and 5 resistances, so overall it's pretty balanced, with your main issue being Steel types tanking all your moves, I guess. But if you use a Sunstone on your Gloom, it will become a Blossom, and as such become a pure Grass type. And as we know, Grass is pretty universally considered a bad typing because of the abundance of weaknesses and lack of consequential advantages. I believe this is the only example of a Pokemon permanently evolving from 2 types into 1. And of course, they had to make it worse since Grass by itself has more weaknesses and fewer resistances than when it's paired with Poison. And maybe you could keep some of those Poison moves on Blossom for coverage if you want, but it's still gonna lose the stab power behind them. If Blossom had become a Fairy type or something different, that would be one thing. But to willingly choose one type, the lesser one at that, when the entire line has always been dual-typed is utterly bewildering. There was never a time in Oddish's life where it didn't have Poison, so why would it lose that trait now? It's not like Grass and Poison is a powerhouse combination like Poison and Steel would be, but you can clearly look at the stats, see the worst matchups and reduced offensive capabilities of pure Grass, and I don't know why you would ever forego your chance at a Vileplume. Maybe you could have argued that it was to stand out from the other Gen 1 Grass types, But Blossom wasn't in Gen 1, and actually could have used some poison to avoid blending in since pure grass types were the most common of Gen 2. So the whole thing is really a mess, and maybe you could argue that losing a type could somehow be valuable in some scenarios, but this is certainly not the case to try it out when the numbers make this evolution objectively worse. Then again, Slugma gaining the rock type doesn't do it any favors, so maybe it's actually the worst. Which Pokemon do you think gets a worse typing upon evolution? Let me know down in the comments. Also be sure to leave a like, share this video, and subscribe so that you too can become an Imperial today. And until next time, stay grounded.